Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of the world's leading gatherings of security, economic, diplomatic, and cultural leaders from around the world. And one of those thought leaders is Theresa Hitchens, my old friend, former colleague, former Defense News editor, current space expert, who lived in Geneva for many years. And now you're at the University of Maryland, so we welcome you back to DC, where you're doing a lot of space policy and cyber work, and you've always been one of the critics of the weaponization of space. For as long as I've known you, you've raised concerns about that, and you've studied the issue. The National Defense Authorization Act this year has anti-ballistic missile space weapons, and so talk to us about what some of your concerns are, because talk to us about what some of your concerns are.
Okay. With regard to the NDAA, it has language in it that would force the Pentagon to begin a program of not only experimentation but deployment of space-based missile defenses for boost phase intercept, that is, intercepting the missile at a very early stage of its rise. And that concept has been around for a very long time, since the 80s. And it's been disproven a number of times from a technical standpoint. But we will leave aside the technical and economic insanity of this idea to get straight to the geopolitical insanity. The very act of experimenting with, and much less deploying, space-based missile defenses is going to cause a great upheaval in U.S. relations with China and Russia, who already suspect that missile defense is a cover for anti-satellite weapons. They've made that very clear over the past several years, and we will, in effect, have taken the first steps to put actual weapons in space. Now, that said, China and Russia have been experimenting with technologies that can be used as weapons, but their experimentation has not gone any farther than things that the United States has already done. This would be a game changer geostrategically, and it would be an ugly game changer.
How do you respond to those who, for example, those say that both the Chinese and the Russians have experimented with systems in space, that we have worked very hard to determine what they are on intersecting orbits with our spacecraft? Some have called them space mines. Then the second thing is that the Chinese actually destroyed a satellite in orbit, leaving so much wreckage in orbit that it's actually a bit of a challenge for people in the space community. So how do you counter this sort of sense that, well, look, in many respects, we are responding to some of these threats by trying to be as responsible as we can to give that kind of defense, given that 38 nations around the world depend on us for their security?
Yeah, I mean, it is very clear that both Russia and China in recent years have really started to pursue these kinds of dual-use technologies that could be used as weapons, okay? The Chinese did an straight-up ASAT test in 2007, as we all know, and as you said, created a large mess for everyone else, and themselves included. But you have to realize that test was not really very different from tests that the United States and Russia undertook in the 80s. And I do think the Chinese were actually kind of shocked that at the international opprobrium that followed their tests. They saw themselves as catching up with the Joneses and were a bit concerned about what happened. You have not seen them blow anything up in space since. They learned at least that lesson, not to do kinetics. The Russians, you know about the Olymp satellite, you just mentioned it, the satellite that's been kind of sneaking around in geo and sidling up nicely to other people's satellites. And the Russians haven't given us a lot of explanation about what it's doing. But technologically, from what we can see, that is almost exactly the same thing that the U.S. GSAP satellites, the Geostationary Space Situational Awareness Program satellites, do. We have said these are for inspection. They get up close and personal with other satellites, including ones that aren't ours, and are watching the space environment. Those satellites have the same capacity to be used as weapons. So what I'm trying to say is that I do believe that both Russia and China see the U.S. space assets as a vulnerable point, with good reason, because we have structured our space systems, our space system writ large, in a way that leaves it open to all kinds of attacks. We have not thought about resiliency, about plan A and plan B. If we lose one of these big, expensive satellites that are three to a constellation, we haven't really planned ahead for how to deal with the fact that Russia and China eventually were going to catch up, and they were going to see this as a possible target in a conflict. We really need to think about what we wish for. Mm-hmm. Is what we wish for a situation in space where everyone is armed to the teeth and you can't tell a weapons-bearing satellite from a good satellite that's doing something like satellite servicing? So do we really want to put all those things at risk for destruction or disruption? We've said that we don't want to use kinetic energy weapons in space. General Hyten is on the record about that. On the other hand, we also don't have in our doctrine or our policies any prohibition against doing so. And we can't expect that just because we have sophisticated ways that we can disrupt an adversary's space communications or their intelligence gathering or their Earth imaging, that other countries are going to be able to have such sophisticated capabilities. They're going to fight back with the machete when we have the gun.
Right.
And that's what we're going to get.
I spoke to an Air Force base official recently, and their point was, in any sort of space conflict, space could get unusable in a permanent way very, very quickly. So his point was that from our tactical and doctrinal, we don't necessarily want to engage in anything that does that because we're so dependent on it. On the other hand, there have been some writings about why the other guys actually may consider their aims sufficient that they're willing to do that.
Yeah.
You worked on all sorts of international accords and agreements and even a treaty to try to... Talk to us about what sort of treaty, what would it look like, what would it take to pass it, given that space is considered to be the high ground that is vital for everybody, societally as well as militarily, and let's not do anything to sort of screw that up on a permanent basis.
Yeah, there have been discussions at the UN for a long time on how to find diplomatic solutions to some of these problems. When you say treaty, I'm going to tell you that there's not going to be a treaty anytime soon because nation states at this juncture geopolitically don't like treaties, particularly the U.S., but other countries, as Western countries in particular. What has been in the offing are rules of the road. Again, General Hyten's talked about this, the need for rules of the road. This is understandings, it's voluntary agreements that say, okay, don't do this in space. This is bad for everyone. This stuff you can do, this stuff you shouldn't do. And while that doesn't have legal force, those kinds of agreements have histories, have structures that have proven their value. For example, the U.S. and the Soviet Union never had an anti-ASAT treaty. In other words, they never banned anti-satellite weapons. But since the 80s, they've never tested them, deliberately tested them, because they had a mutual agreement, a gentleman's agreement, that said this is going to be bad for nuclear stability. And we don't want that to happen. So we're just going to have self-restraint. That was actually the motto of the Obama administration on these issues was strategic restraint, which meant we weren't going to do anything really provocative first. We were going to work towards international norms. We were going to try to sort these things out. That takes a long time. It's difficult. It's really difficult now because of the geopolitical situation with Russia. But it is, in the long run, part of a package of answers. If you talk about deterrence, which we have to talk about in the military sphere, given the current situation, deterrence has many elements. One is deterrence by punishment. If you do that bad thing, I'm going to do very bad things to you, okay? That's kind of classic military thinking about deterrence. There's a second kind of deterrence, deterrence by denial. That means making your stuff really hard and really costly to take away, so that maybe people go, it's not worth my time, it's not worth my money. We are starting to think about how to do that in space, but we have not implemented that. That's when you get back to this idea of resiliency. Could you replace the big military satellites that are expensive and few for communications with a bunch of small ones in low Earth orbit that would mean if you took out one, it wouldn't really hurt you because you have a distributed network. We could do that because the technology today has made that possible. Have we done that? No, we have not, because we have legacy systems, we have legacy forces, we have turf, we have, all those things. So resiliency is part of a package that goes with diplomatic measures. In deterrence theory, there's also another kind of deterrence, and it's called deterrence by assurance, or positive deterrence. It means making it worth somebody else's while to not do the bad thing, or convincing them that it's actually worth it for them to do the right thing, that they gain benefit from that, security benefit. And we haven't even begun to explore those things with the Chinese, with the Russians, because we're not talking to them. And if we don't talk to them, we don't know what they want and what it would take for them to say, okay, you're right, this is a bad way to go. And until we have those kinds of discussions, I think we're going to be locked in this almost reprise of the Cold War, what's called mirror imaging. Whatever the Chinese do in space is obviously bad. It's obviously going to be weaponized. And they look at us and say the same thing. So you have a vicious circle.
The administration is working its national security strategy, its defense strategy. Where do you think they're going to end up? What advice do you have for them as they write that to craft, from what your perspective would be, the safe, sane, sensible, strategic approach?
Okay, first of all, do not go down the path of space-based missile defenses. You will complicate matters and you will create a serious negative situation where other countries feel obliged to target those things. So you will speed up this incipient space arms race by doing that. That would be a very bad thing. Otherwise, I would say we really need to rethink the idea of a bargain, a deal. This president prides himself on making deals, and we need to think about how we make a deal in space that protects us all, that prevents us from having to do the things that the U.S. Air Force really, truly doesn't actually want to do, but it believes that they're being pushed into a corner to have to do. And we haven't explored those options thoroughly. We've participated in these international forums at the UN, but we haven't really done the due diligence with the primary potential adversaries to say, okay, how do we make a deal with you?
Theresa Hitchens of the University of Maryland, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Take care.